Before we begin, a content warning. This documentary examines historical acts of extreme cruelty and violence during the Holocaust. The material is presented for educational purposes, with respect for the victims and their testimony. Viewer discretion is advised. April 15, 1945. British forces liberate Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in northern Germany. What they found defied comprehension. 13,000 corpses lay unburied, piled in mass graves and scattered across the camp grounds. 60,000 prisoners remained alive, if barely, ravaged by starvation, typhus, and tuberculosis. The scenes recorded by cameramen that day would become some of the most harrowing images of the 20th century. Within days, the British military government began urgent investigations. They needed answers to fundamental questions. Who committed these crimes? Who gave the orders? Who carried them out? Within weeks, they had arrested dozens of suspects, including 3 women whose names would soon become synonymous with the darkest chapters of Nazi terror. Irma Grese, 21 years old. Elisabeth Volkenrath, 26. Johanna Bormann, 52. These women worked as concentration camp guards. They beat prisoners, selected victims for gas chambers, and participated directly in mass murder. By December of that same year, all 3 would be dead, executed by hanging after Britain's largest war crimes trial. But here is the question that haunts us still. These 3 women represented only the tiniest fraction of those responsible. Modern historians estimate that approximately 3,500 women served as SS guards in the Nazi concentration camp system. Only 77 were ever brought to trial. This is the story not only of justice served, but of justice denied. This is the story of how ordinary women became perpetrators of extraordinary evil and how the vast majority simply walked away. To understand how these women ended up at Bergen-Belsen, we must first understand who they were before the war and how the SS recruited them. Irma Grese was born in 1923 in Rechen, a small farming village in Mecklenburg. Her father was a dairy worker. The family was poor, struggling through Germany's economic chaos of the 1920s and 30s. Irma left school at 14 and worked various jobs, a shop assistant, then a farm laborer. By most accounts, there was nothing exceptional about her youth, no early signs of sadism, no particular ideological fervor. She was simply a working-class girl with limited prospects in a devastated economy. Elisabeth Volkenrath came from a slightly better background. Born in Schernau and der Katzbach in Silesia in 1919, she completed more education than Grese and worked in retail. Like millions of young Germans, she joined Nazi youth organizations, not unusual in an era when such membership often determined whether you could get a job or attend school. Johanna Bormann, the eldest of our 3 subjects, was born in 1993 in Birkenfelde. She married and had children, worked as a laborer. Her entry into the camp system came later in life, through channels that remain somewhat murky but likely involved economic necessity and local recruitment drives. The critical moment for all 3 came when they encountered SS recruitment, efforts targeting young women for guard service. This process deserves careful examination because it reveals how a modern bureaucratic state mobilized ordinary citizens into mechanisms of genocide. Beginning in 1938, the SS faced a labor shortage. As the concentration camp system expanded, particularly with the annexation of Austria and later the occupation of Poland, the SS needed more personnel. Male guards were increasingly diverted to combat roles as the war progressed. The solution was to recruit women. The SS advertised these positions as respectable employment, civil service work with decent pay, housing, and benefits. For young women from poor backgrounds with few career options, this represented genuine economic opportunity. The SS required applicants to be German citizens, prove Aryan ancestry, demonstrate physical fitness, and show political reliability, meaning membership in Nazi party organizations. But they did not require sadistic tendencies or even strong ideological commitment. They needed bodies to fill positions. Training took place primarily at Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp north of Berlin, which also served as the central training facility for female guards. Irma Grese arrived at Ravensbrück in 1942. Elisabeth Volkenrath came earlier in 1941. The training program lasted several weeks and combined ideological indoctrination with practical instruction. SS doctrine taught that prisoners were enemies of the Reich, subhuman threats to German racial purity and national security. Guards learned that cruelty was not merely permitted but required. Showing mercy or sympathy toward prisoners constituted betrayal. The training deliberately brutalized the recruits themselves, hardening them through harsh discipline and desensitizing them to violence by forcing them to witness and participate in beatings and punishments. Elissa Maylander, a historian who has studied female guards extensively, describes a process of moral transformation. Women entered the system for mundane reasons, economic need, social pressure, limited alternatives. But the environment of the camps, the constant dehumanization of prisoners, the peer pressure among guards, the normalization of violence, the rewards for cruelty, transformed many into active perpetrators. This was not inevitable. Some women remained what we might call passive guards, doing the minimum required, occasionally showing small mercies. But others embraced the role with enthusiasm. Irma Grese was one of these. After her training at Ravensbrück, she received promotions rapidly. By 1943, still only 19 years old, she was transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau. There, she rose to senior supervisor, responsible for thousands of women prisoners. Elisabeth Volkenrath also served at Auschwitz, where she held supervisory positions over large prisoner populations. Johanna Bormann worked at multiple camps, including Auschwitz and its sub-camps. All three would eventually be transferred to Bergen-Belsen as the Reich collapsed and camps in the east were evacuated. The question that emerged at trial, and persists in historical scholarship, is how much of their behavior resulted from SS indoctrination and institutional pressure versus pre-existing psychological traits. The honest answer is we see both factors at work. The SS created an environment where cruelty was normalized, rewarded, and mandatory for career advancement. But women responded to this environment differently. Grese actively sought promotion and used violence enthusiastically and creatively beyond what orders required. Volkenrath executed orders efficiently and participated in selections for the gas chambers. Bormann became known for setting her attack dog on prisoners, earning her the nickname, the woman with the dogs. These distinctions matter because they reveal that even within totalitarian systems, individuals retain moral agency. They make choices, and each of these women made choices that resulted in immense suffering and death. Now we turn to what these women actually did, the specific crimes documented by survivors and presented as evidence at trial. I want to be clear about methodology here. Everything I'm about to describe comes from trial transcripts, sworn testimony from multiple witnesses, and corroborating evidence accepted by the British military court. We are not dealing with rumors or post-war exaggerations. These are documented facts, established through rigorous legal process. The Belsen trial began in September 1945 at the Curio House in Lüneburg, Germany. The British charged 45 defendants with war crimes, including the 3 women we're examining. The prosecution presented testimony from dozens of survivors, creating a detailed record of the camp system's daily operations and the defendants' specific roles. Multiple survivors testified about Irma Grese. Gerda Perlak, a Polish Jewish prisoner, described how Grese beat women during roll call with a plated whip, striking faces and breasts deliberately. Alona Stein testified that Grese participated in selections at Auschwitz, choosing which prisoners would be sent to the gas chambers. This was typically done on the ramp when transports arrived or during periodic selections within the camp, when SS doctors and supervisors decided who was too weak to work. Henke Rosenzweig, another survivor, testified that Grese shot prisoners and that she carried a pistol which she used with casual frequency. Rose Gutman-Friedman described how Grese would walk through the women's camp with her dog, an Alsatian, threatening prisoners, and setting the animal on women who moved too slowly or failed to show proper deference. Perhaps most disturbingly, multiple witnesses testified about Grese's apparent pleasure in violence. Helena Copper stated that Grese smiled while beating prisoners, that she seemed to enjoy their suffering. This detail appeared in multiple testimonies and became central to understanding her psychological profile. Elisabeth Volkenrath's crimes were equally well documented. Dr. Ada Bimko, a Polish Jewish doctor who survived Auschwitz and Belsen, testified that Volkenrath supervised selections at Auschwitz. Volkenrath would stand on the ramp as trains arrived and point left or right, sending people either to forced labor or immediate death in the gas chambers. Dr. Bimco estimated that Volkenrath participated in selections involving tens of thousands of people. Other witnesses described Volkenrath's brutality in daily camp operations. She beat prisoners regularly, withheld food as punishment, and enforced the camp's murderous discipline. Anita Lasker-Wallfish, who survived because she played cello in the women's orchestra at Auschwitz, later wrote about Volkenrath's cold efficiency, describing her as someone who operated the machinery of death without apparent emotion, simply doing her job. Johanna Bormann's signature cruelty involved her dogs. Dozens of witnesses testified that she routinely set her attack dogs on prisoners, causing severe injuries and deaths. Dora Rosenthal testified that Bormann ordered her dog to attack a woman who had not moved fast enough during roll call. The dog tore the woman's flesh, and she died from her wounds. Another witness, whose name was recorded as Malik, described watching Bormann set her dog on a group of children. The systematic nature of this violence was emphasizing. This was not a single incident of losing control. Multiple witnesses from different camps, Auschwitz, Belsen, and satellite camps, testified to the same pattern. Bormann used her dogs as instruments of terror and torture routinely. The trial transcripts, which are now digitized and available through institutions including the Imperial War Museum and the Bergen-Belsen Memorial Site, provide extraordinary detail. We can read the actual words of survivors, see how prosecutors built their cases, observe how defendants responded. This documentary evidence matters enormously, not only for historical accuracy but for counter-historical denial. These events are not matters of interpretation or debate. They happened. They were documented contemporaneously. The perpetrators were identified, tried, and convicted based on evidence that meets any reasonable standard of justice. The defendants' responses to these charges revealed much about how perpetrators processed their own actions. Irma Grese claimed she was merely following orders, that she never beat anyone without authorization, that her actions were consistent with camp regulations. This was legally irrelevant under the war crimes framework. Crimes against humanity and violations of the laws and customs of war could not be excused by superior orders, particularly when the crimes were manifestly illegal. Elisabeth Volkenrath similarly claimed she only followed orders and minimized her role in selections. She admitted being present, but claimed she simply escorted prisoners and did not make decisions about who lived or died. Survivor testimony directly contradicted this, describing how she actively gestured and selected victims. Johanna Bormann denied that her dogs attacked anyone without cause, claiming she only released them when prisoners posed security threats. Again, witness after witness contradicted this, describing unprovoked attacks on starving, defenseless people. The prosecutors, led by Colonel T.M. Backhouse, systematically demolished these defenses. They presented the testimony of not one or two witnesses, but dozens, all describing consistent patterns of behavior. They showed that the defendants held positions of authority, made independent decisions, and exercised discretion in how they treated prisoners. They demonstrated that the defendants' actions went far beyond following orders, showing initiative and enthusiasm in inflicting suffering. By late November 1945, after just over 2 months of testimony, the court reached its verdicts. The Belsen trial concluded on November 17, 1945. Of 45 defendants, 30 were convicted. 11 received death sentences. Among those sentenced to death were Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann. The sentences were not foregone conclusions. The British military court applied genuine legal standards, acquitted some defendants, and imposed varying sentences based on individual culpability. The death sentences reflected findings that these defendants bore direct personal responsibility for murders and extreme cruelty. The court-martial's findings emphasized several factors. First, the defendants held positions of authority and used that authority to inflict suffering beyond any military or administrative necessity. Second, they demonstrated cruelty as a pattern of behavior, not isolated incidents. Third, they showed no remorse and continued lying under oath about their actions. These findings appear in the trial's official judgment, which is preserved in British military archives and has been examined extensively by historians including N. C. H. Beresford, whose doctoral thesis provides detailed analysis of the trial's legal framework and proceedings. The executions were scheduled for December 13, 1945, at Hamelin Prison. Britain employed professional executioners for such tasks, operating under protocols designed to ensure quick, humane death. The executioner for the Belsen convicts was Albert Pierrepoint, who later wrote a memoir describing his career. Pierrepoint's account of the Belsen executions provides our most detailed contemporary description. He traveled to Hamelin with an assistant and prepared the gallows according to standard procedures. The condemned prisoners were weighed so that the drop could be calculated precisely, long enough to ensure instant death by breaking the neck, not so long as to cause decapitation. Pierrepoint describes Irma Grese's execution briefly and without sensationalism. She was brought to the gallows at mid-morning. She walked calmly, made no statement, and showed no obvious emotion. The execution was carried out efficiently. She died instantly. Pierrepoint notes that she was 22 years old, younger than some of his assistants. Elisabeth Volkenrath and Johanna Bormann were executed the same day, along with the 8 other condemned prisoners. Pierrepoint's memoir emphasizes the mechanical nature of his work. He was not there to judge or punish in an emotional sense. His job was to carry out sentences imposed by lawful courts, to do so efficiently and humanely. He records that the Belsen executions weighed on him nonetheless. These were the first women he had executed, and despite their crimes, he found the task affecting. This detail matters because it reminds us that even those who administered justice experienced moral complexities. The executions were not acts of revenge or mob violence but formal legal proceedings, yet they still involved the deliberate killing of human beings. That tension between justice and killing, between legitimate punishment and the act of execution itself, remains unresolved in many ways. British and international media covered the trial and executions extensively. Newspapers published details of the verdicts and sentences. Newsreels showed footage of the trial proceedings. The executions themselves were not filmed or photographed, consistent with British practice. But the trial footage and photographs that do exist provide remarkable historical records. We can see the defendants sitting in the dock, wearing civilian clothes, looking remarkably ordinary. This ordinariness itself became a subject of commentary. Observers expected monsters and saw instead everyday people, young women who might work in shops or offices, older women who looked like someone's grandmother. This cognitive dissonance between appearance and actions challenges our comfortable assumptions about evil. We want perpetrators to look different, to be identifiable as dangerous. But one lesson of the Holocaust is that perpetrators look exactly like everyone else because they are ordinary people who made extraordinary choices. The Belsen trial was celebrated as a landmark achievement in international justice. It represented one of the first major war crimes prosecutions, preceding even some of the Nuremberg trials. It demonstrated that the Allied powers were serious about accountability. It provided a measure of justice for survivors, allowing them to testify and see perpetrators convicted. And it created a detailed historical record that would serve education and documentation for generations. But this narrative of justice contains a massive hole, one that becomes apparent only when we examine the broader statistical reality of accountability for female concentration camp guards. And this is where our documentary must pivot from the story of 3 women who were punished to the story of thousands who were not. Modern historical research has reconstructed the scale of female participation in the camp guard system with increasing precision. Historian Gudrun Schwarz estimates approximately 3,500 women served as SS guards in concentration camps during the Nazi period. Other scholars suggest the number may be as high as 4,000. These women worked at major camps including Ravensbrück, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Bergen-Belsen, and dozens of smaller camps and sub-camps. They supervised prisoners, participated in selections, enforced brutal discipline, and enabled the functioning of the entire extermination system. Yet the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's detailed records on post-war trials indicate only 77 women were ever brought to trial for concentration camp crimes. Think about that disparity. 3,500 perpetrators, 77 prosecuted. That represents roughly 2%. 98% of women who served as SS guards never faced legal accountability. They simply returned to civilian life after the war and lived out their years untroubled by justice systems. How did this happen? The failure of accountability resulted from multiple interrelated factors: legal, political, and social. First, the immediate post-war period prioritized prosecuting major war criminals and high-ranking officials. Allied resources and attention focused on the Nuremberg trials and similar proceedings against military and political leadership. Lower-ranking perpetrators, including most guards, fell into a category of lesser priority. Second, as the Cold War emerged, Western allies and the new West German government increasingly prioritized reconstruction and alliance building over continuing war crimes prosecutions. By the late 1940s, political will for pursuing former Nazis declined sharply. The United States and Britain wanted West Germany as a partner against Soviet expansion. Continuing to dig into the Nazi past seemed counterproductive to that goal. Third, evidentiary problems made prosecution difficult. Many witnesses had died, either during the Holocaust itself or in the chaotic post-war period. Survivors were scattered globally, many emigrating to Israel, the Americas, or other countries. Gathering testimony became logistically difficult and expensive. Camp records were incomplete or destroyed. Proving individual culpability for specific crimes required detailed evidence that often no longer existed. Fourth, and perhaps most insidiously, gender biases influenced prosecution decisions. Male authorities in Allied governments and post-war German institutions often viewed women as less culpable or less dangerous than male perpetrators. Historian Annette Wieverke, who has analyzed gender in post-war trials extensively, documents how prosecutors and judges sometimes struggled to reconcile images of femininity with evidence of extreme violence. This cognitive dissonance sometimes resulted in women receiving lighter sentences or not being prosecuted at all, even when evidence of their crimes existed. The assumption that women acted under male authority or coercion, rather than as independent moral agents, appears frequently in post-war legal documents. This was not only unjust but factually wrong. As the Belsen trial demonstrated, women guards exercised substantial authority and made independent choices about how to wield it. The early releases and pardons of the 1950s compound this failure of justice. Even among those few women who were prosecuted and convicted, many served only a fraction of their sentences. Political pressure, particularly from West German churches and civil society groups, pushed for clemency. Arguments were made that these women had suffered enough, that continuing imprisonment served no purpose, that mercy and Christian forgiveness should prevail. In 1951, the British government released several Belsen trial defendants who had received prison sentences rather than execution. The United States released numerous convicted war criminals from its trials during the same period. By the mid-1950s, very few individuals convicted of Holocaust crimes remained imprisoned. This pattern of early release extended to some of the most serious offenders, people directly involved in mass murder who served perhaps 5 or 10 years and then resumed normal lives. Herman Braunsteiner provides a particularly egregious example, though one involving American rather than British jurisdiction. Braunsteiner served as a guard at Ravensbrück and Majdanek. Survivors testified to her extreme brutality, including stomping prisoners to death with her steel-tipped boots, earning her the nickname, the Mayor of Majdanek. She was arrested in 1948 and tried by an Austrian court, convicted and sentenced to 3 years. She served the sentence, emigrated to Canada, then moved to the United States, where she married and lived quietly in Queens, New York, until Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal identified her in 1964. After lengthy extradition proceedings, West Germany tried her in the 1970s. She received a life sentence, but served only part of it before being released for health reasons. She died in 1999, having lived the majority of her life after the war as a free person. Herta Both, another Belsen guard convicted at the 1945 trial, received a 10-year sentence. She was released early and returned to ordinary life in Germany. In a 1999 interview, decades after her conviction, Both was asked if she felt guilt about her actions at Belsen. Her response was chilling. She said, "Do I feel guilty? No, I feel no guilt. I was assigned to Belsen, that's where I was, what more can I say?" This statement encapsulates the profound moral failure at the heart of perpetrator psychology. Even after conviction, even after survivors testified about specific crimes, even after serving time in prison, Both felt no remorse. She continued to view her actions as morally neutral, simply following assignments, doing a job. This documented lack of remorse appears consistently in interviews and statements from convicted guards. Irma Grese, before her execution, maintained she had done nothing wrong and was being killed unjustly. When the execution warrant was read to her, witnesses report she remained defiant, not accepting guilt. Most guards who survived never publicly acknowledged wrongdoing. They framed themselves as victims, persecuted for following orders, punished for circumstances beyond their control. This persistent denial raises profound questions. How do we understand perpetrators who commit atrocities, yet feel no guilt or remorse? What psychological mechanisms enable people to maintain moral equilibrium after participating in genocide? Psychologists and historians have proposed several explanatory frameworks. Albert Bandura's work on moral disengagement describes processes by which people deactivate self-sanctions that normally prevent harmful conduct. These include moral justification, convincing yourself that your actions serve a higher purpose; euphemistic labeling, using sanitized language that obscures the nature of actions; advantageous comparison, claiming your behavior is less bad than someone else's; displacement of responsibility, claiming you were just following orders; diffusion of responsibility, claiming many people were involved so no one individual is culpable; distortion of consequences, minimizing or denying the harm caused; dehumanization of victims, viewing them as less than fully human and therefore unworthy of moral consideration; attribution of blame, claiming victims brought suffering on themselves. Reviewing trial testimony and post-war interviews, we see concentration camp guards deploying virtually all of these mechanisms. Grese claimed she was following orders and that prisoners were enemies of Germany. Volkenrath minimized her role and suggested she had no choice. Bormann blamed prisoners for provoking her dogs. Psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton's research on Nazi doctors proposes the concept of doubling, a psychological split where perpetrators develop separate selves, one that functions normally in everyday life and one that operates in the genocidal environment. This allows someone to be a loving parent at home and a brutal killer at work without experiencing cognitive dissonance. While Lifton focused on doctors, the mechanism applies to guards as well. Many had families, maintained relationships, participated in social activities, all while committing atrocities professionally. This psychological compartmentalization helps explain the ordinariness of perpetrators and their ability to return to normal life after the war. Hannah Arendt's famous phrase, "the banality of evil," from her coverage of the Eichmann trial, captures something essential about these cases. Arendt observed that Eichmann was not a monster or sadist, but a bureaucrat who thoughtlessly implemented policy. Critics have noted that Arendt's analysis underestimated ideological commitment and personal agency. And indeed, some guards like Grese demonstrated sadism beyond bureaucratic function. But the core insight remains valuable. Most perpetrators are ordinary people who accept systems of cruelty and participate in them without deep reflection on moral implications. The scariest thing about the Holocaust is not that it required monsters, but that it was implemented by normal people who made terrible choices. This brings us back to the systemic failure of accountability and what it means for historical memory and future prevention of genocide. The fact that 98% of female guards never faced trial represents not only an injustice to victims, but a broader societal failure to reckon with how genocide happens and who makes it possible. By focusing only on top leadership, the Nuremberg trials and similar proceedings created a misleading narrative that the Holocaust was perpetrated by a small number of evil masterminds who commanded otherwise innocent populations. In reality, genocide requires thousands of willing participants at all levels. It requires guards to brutalize prisoners daily. It requires clerks to process paperwork. It requires trained conductors to transport victims. It requires neighbors to report Jews in hiding. It requires bureaucrats to administer confiscated property. It requires business people to profit from slave labor. The Holocaust was not the work of a handful of monsters, but a collective project involving millions of participants and bystanders. Failing to prosecute the vast majority of guards and lower-level perpetrators allowed a dangerous myth to take hold: that ordinary Germans were victims of Nazi leadership rather than participants in Nazi crimes. This myth facilitated post-war reconciliation and reconstruction, but at tremendous cost to historical truth and moral clarity. It enabled former Nazis to reintegrate into positions of influence in government, business, education, and law, where they shaped post-war German society. It meant victims and survivors often encountered their former tormentors living freely, sometimes prosperously, with no acknowledgement of crimes committed. It deprived society of a full reckoning with how totalitarianism mobilizes ordinary citizens into perpetrators, and it left open the possibility that similar processes could occur again. The contrast between the vigorous prosecution of major figures at Nuremberg and the near-total impunity for lower-level perpetrators reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how genocide works. Prosecuting leadership is important. Those who plan and order mass murder bear special responsibility, but genocide cannot be executed by leadership alone. It requires a massive infrastructure of willing participants. Every guard who beat a prisoner, every clerk who processed a deportation order, every train conductor who knew they were transporting people to death camps, every neighbor who reported Jews to authorities, every business owner who exploited slave labor made a choice. They could have refused, sought transfer, feigned incompetence, engaged in subtle sabotage, or simply performed their roles with minimal rather than enthusiastic cruelty. Many did choose these forms of resistance or non-participation, demonstrating that even within totalitarian systems, moral agency persists. But many others did not. They participated fully and sometimes eagerly, and the vast majority of these participants never faced consequences. What message does this send to future potential perpetrators? What lesson does it teach about accountability? If history shows that participating in genocide carries minimal personal risk, while refusal might endanger career or safety, the cost-benefit analysis tilts dangerously toward participation. Robust accountability, even decades after crimes occur, sends the opposite message. It demonstrates that participation in genocide is not an acceptable response to political pressures or career incentives, that individual choices matter morally and legally, that "I was following orders" is not a defense, and that societies will pursue justice even when it is difficult and expensive. The failure to prosecute 98% of female camp guards represents a missed opportunity to establish these principles firmly. Contemporary documentation proves we can identify perpetrators even decades after crimes occur. The work of organizations like the Simon Wiesenthal Center and government agencies like the Office of Special Investigations in the United States demonstrates that with political will and resources, it remains possible to investigate, prosecute, and convict even elderly defendants for Holocaust crimes. The German justice system has continued to bring cases against former concentration camp personnel into the 21st century, including Oskar Gröning, the Auschwitz bookkeeper convicted in 2015 at age 93, and most recently several guards prosecuted in their 90s. These late prosecutions matter symbolically and practically. They affirm that crimes against humanity have no statute of limitations. They provide opportunities for historical documentation and education. They offer survivors and descendants a measure of acknowledgement and justice. And they demonstrate societal commitment to moral principles that transcend political expedience. But these late prosecutions also highlight how exceptional accountability remains. For every elderly defendant finally brought to trial in the 21st century, thousands of perpetrators lived their entire lives in freedom. The women who served as camp guards alongside Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann, who participated in the same crimes and perhaps demonstrated similar cruelty, simply went home after the war. They married, raised families, worked jobs, participated in communities, voted, traveled, enjoyed freedoms that they had systematically denied to millions of victims. Many certainly kept their pasts secret, fearing social stigma, if not legal consequences. But many others lived openly, their histories known to neighbors and acquaintances who chose to overlook or minimize their wartime activities. This social forgetting complemented legal impunity in creating a post-war environment where former perpetrators could reintegrate without reckoning. West German society of the 1950s and 60s prioritized economic recovery and Cold War alignment over confronting the Nazi past. The phrase, "let's not talk about the war," became virtually a cultural norm. Families often included both victims and perpetrators, or at least perpetrators' relatives, creating painful silences and unresolved tensions. Only in subsequent generations, as descendants began asking questions and historians began reconstructing fuller accounts, did German society begin a more honest reckoning with perpetration and complicity. This process remains ongoing and contested. The question of how ordinary women became perpetrators of extreme cruelty thus connects to larger questions about how societies produce, enable, and then fail to adequately confront genocide. Individual psychology matters. The women we've examined made personal choices and bear personal responsibility. But individual actions occur within systems that shape options, incentives, and moral frameworks. The Nazi state created the concentration camp system, developed the ideology that justified it, recruited and trained guards, rewarded cruelty, and punished mercy. Women who entered this system faced powerful pressures toward participation. Some resisted those pressures, some accommodated to them minimally, some embraced them enthusiastically. The enthusiastic participation of guards like Grese, Volkenrath, and Bormann cannot be attributed only to system pressures, but neither can it be understood in isolation from those pressures. Similarly, the post-war failure to prosecute the vast majority of perpetrators reflects not only logistical challenges, but political choices. Allied governments and the West German government chose to prioritize other objectives over comprehensive accountability. They chose to view low-ranking perpetrators as less important than leadership. They chose to accept claims of following orders rather than rigorously investigating individual culpability. They chose to grant clemency and early release rather than insisting on full sentences. Each of these choices reflected particular values and priorities. Different choices were possible. Some jurisdictions, particularly in Eastern Europe and Israel, pursued more extensive prosecutions. The choice not to prosecute the 98% was exactly that, a choice. As we conclude, I want to return to the Belsen liberation footage with which we began, but now viewed through the lens of what we've learned. Those 13,000 unburied corpses, those 60,000 starving prisoners, represented the endpoint of a systematic process of dehumanization and murder. That process required human implementation at every stage. It required guards to beat and starve prisoners daily over months and years. It required selections to identify who would live and who would die. It required operation of gas chambers and crematoria. It required management of labor assignments that worked people to death. It required systematic denial of food, medical care, sanitation, and shelter. Every single one of those acts required individual human beings to perform them. Most of those individual human beings were never held accountable. The three women whose stories we've examined in detail, Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann, represent the tiny fraction who did face justice. Their prosecution, conviction, and execution demonstrated that accountability was possible. The evidence presented against them, the testimony of survivors, the verdicts of military courts, the carrying out of sentences, showed that even in the chaos of post-war Europe, justice could be achieved. Their trial created a historical record that serves education and documentation to this day. Their punishment affirmed that participation in genocide carries consequences, but the failure to extend that accountability to the vast majority of their fellow guards represents a profound systemic failure. It denied justice to countless victims. It allowed perpetrators to escape the consequences of their choices. It created a false historical narrative that minimized the scope of participation in Nazi crimes, and it failed to establish robust precedents that might deter future perpetrators. What should we take from this history? First, that genocide is not the work of a few monsters, but the collective product of thousands of ordinary people making terrible choices. The bureaucrats, the guards, the clerks, the train conductors, the neighbors who report or fail to hide the persecuted, all contribute to machinery of mass murder. Each individual choice may seem small or constrained by circumstances, but collectively, these choices enable atrocity. Second, that women as well as men serve as perpetrators. Gendered assumptions that women are inherently peaceful or nurturing or less capable of violence are empirically false and morally dangerous. Women guards at concentration camps exercised authority brutally. They made independent choices to inflict suffering. They bear full moral and legal responsibility for those choices. Recognizing female agency in perpetration is essential to honest history and effective prevention. Third, that accountability matters profoundly. Prosecuting perpetrators serves multiple purposes: justice for victims, documentation for history, deterrence for potential future perpetrators, and affirmation of moral principles. The failure to prosecute 98% of female camp guards represents a lost opportunity on all these dimensions. While late prosecutions provide some measure of accountability, they cannot fully compensate for decades of impunity. Fourth, that psychological mechanisms of moral disengagement, rationalization, displacement of responsibility, and dehumanization of victims enable ordinary people to participate in atrocities. Understanding these mechanisms is not excusing perpetrators, but rather recognizing how genocide becomes possible. If only monsters committed such crimes, prevention would be simpler. But because ordinary people commit them, through processes of group pressure, ideological justification, and institutional encouragement, prevention requires constant vigilance about these processes in all societies. Fifth, that historical memory and education remain essential. The documentation created by trials like Belsen, the testimony of survivors, the photographs and film footage, the archived records all serve continuing purposes. They combat denial, they educate new generations, they honor victims, they warn against repetition. This documentary itself participates in that project of memory and education. The phrase, "never again," emerged from Holocaust memory as both a slogan and a commitment. Never again would the international community allow such systematic murder. Never again would bystanders remain passive while persecution escalated to genocide. Never again would the world claim ignorance and do nothing. But since 1945, we have seen genocides in Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur, and continuing atrocities against Rohingya, Uyghurs, and other populations. Never again remains an aspiration rather than reality. Why? Partly because the lessons of the Holocaust remain incompletely learned. If we continue to view genocide as the work of monsters rather than ordinary people, we miss warning signs when ordinary people in new contexts begin implementing persecution. If we fail to hold perpetrators accountable comprehensively, we signal that participation carries acceptable risk. If we allow social and political convenience to override commitment to justice and memory, we weaken moral foundations. The women of Bergen-Belsen who walked free, the 98% who were never prosecuted, haunt historical memory. We don't know all their names, we can't recount all their crimes. We have no footage of their trials because they were never tried. We have no documentation of their executions because they were never executed. They simply disappeared into post-war German society, became anonymous again, and died in their beds. This invisibility in history represents an injustice compounding the original crimes. But it also represents a warning. It demonstrates that perpetration of even the worst crimes may carry minimal consequences if society lacks will to pursue accountability. It shows that ordinary people participating in systems of oppression may bet correctly that they will never face punishment. It reveals that justice demands not only symbolic prosecution of leadership, but comprehensive accountability at all levels of perpetration. As we remember Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Ravensbrück, and the entire apparatus of Nazi genocide, we must remember not only victims and heroes but also perpetrators. Not to glorify or sensationalize them, but to understand how they became perpetrators and why most escaped accountability. Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann were prosecuted, convicted, and executed. Their punishment represented justice, but also an exception to the general pattern of impunity. The thousands of other women who served alongside them in the camp system, who committed similar crimes, who made similar choices, simply walked away. We honor Holocaust victims by ensuring their suffering is documented, remembered, and taught. We honor the principle of justice by continuing to pursue accountability even when it is difficult. And we honor the commitment of never again by honestly examining how ordinary people become perpetrators and what enables or prevents such transformations. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen revealed horrors that shocked the world. The Belsen trial demonstrated that accountability was possible and established important precedents. But the failure to extend that accountability to the vast majority of perpetrators represents unfinished business. Some perpetrators have been brought to justice decades later. Many more died without ever facing trial. The historical record now documents their crimes even when courts did not hear cases. Education ensures new generations learn what happened and who made it happen. Moral clarity requires acknowledging that thousands of ordinary women made choices that enabled genocide and that most escaped justice. And commitment to preventing future atrocities requires understanding these patterns of perpetration, impunity, and social amnesia, so we can recognize and interrupt them if they emerge again. The question I posed at the beginning was how seemingly ordinary women became perpetrators of extreme cruelty, and why the vast majority escaped meaningful post-war accountability. We've examined the social and economic circumstances that led women into the SS guard system. We've documented the training and indoctrination that normalized brutality. We've reviewed specific crimes committed by specific individuals. We've seen the trial process that convicted some perpetrators. We've counted the vastly larger number who were never prosecuted. And we've analyzed psychological and political factors that explain both perpetration and impunity. The answer is complex but knowable. Ordinary women became perpetrators through a combination of institutional pressures, ideological indoctrination, personal choices, and psychological mechanisms that enabled moral disengagement. The vast majority escaped accountability because post-war societies prioritized competing objectives over comprehensive justice, because evidence was difficult to gather, because political will diminished rapidly, and because gendered assumptions minimized women's culpability. Understanding these answers doesn't provide closure. There is no closure for industrialized murder of 6 million Jews and millions of other victims, but understanding provides tools. Tools to recognize warning signs of future atrocities. Tools to insist on accountability as a moral imperative. Tools to resist psychological processes that enable participation in cruelty. And tools to honor victims by refusing to forget their suffering or the identities of those who caused it. I leave you with the words of Primo Levi, Auschwitz survivor and witness. Levi wrote, "It happened, therefore it can happen again." This is the core of what we have to say. It can happen, and it can happen everywhere. The women who perpetrated crimes at Bergen-Belsen and throughout the camp system were not uniquely German or uniquely products of their era. They were humans whose choices were shaped by circumstances and institutions, but who retained moral agency. Similar circumstances and institutions could emerge elsewhere at other times. Similar choices could be made by other ordinary people facing pressures to participate in persecution and violence. The only protections are vigilance, education, moral clarity, and insistence on accountability. Remember the victims, document the crimes, name the perpetrators, demand justice, teach the next generation, resist the comfortable myths that genocide is the work of monsters. Recognize that ordinary people made these choices and could make them again. And commit that we will do everything in our power to ensure it does not happen again, knowing that this commitment requires constant work and uncomfortable truths. Never again is not a guarantee. It is a responsibility. Thank you for listening. If this documentary has moved you to learn more, I encourage you to explore the sources cited throughout. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum provides extensive online resources, including trial transcripts and educational materials. The Bergen-Belsen Memorial maintains archives and documentation. The Imperial War Museum's collections include trial footage and witness testimony. Academic historians like Annette Wieverke, Elissa Maylander, and many others have published rigorous scholarship on female perpetrators and post-war justice. Read survivor testimonies. Visit museums and memorial sites if you can. Support institutions that preserve Holocaust memory and education, and apply these lessons to contemporary situations where persecution and atrocities continue. The work of never again is never finished. Each generation must choose whether to remember and resist or forget and risk repetition. I hope you will choose to remember and act. Please subscribe to this channel for more long-form historical documentaries. The description contains links to related videos on the Nuremberg trials and other aspects of post-war justice. Share this documentary with others who value historical education. And most importantly, carry forward the commitment to memory and justice that honors Holocaust victims and protects future generations. Thank you.